Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue. Welcome. Here we are again. We are meeting for the second time on our Defense Industrial Strategy study. This is the 7th meeting of the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Just a friendly reminder to protect the health and well-being of our interpreters. If you are using your earpiece and it's plugged in but not on your ear, please just place it on the sticker in front of you. If it's not plugged in, not to worry about that. That's just relevant to those that have tables in front of them. Colleagues, we're going to try to be effective and efficient today, as always. We've got two witnesses with us here for the first hour of our meeting. From the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the Parliamentary Budget Officer himself is here with us today, Jason Jacques, Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, and Christopher Penny, Senior Advisor from the PBO. So, Mr. Jacques, the floor will be yours for upwards of 5 minutes. Following that, we will get into a line of questioning. Each members of the affiliated political parties here have an allotted amount of time. It will begin with our colleagues from the Conservative Party and then go around the table. If you have any questions at any point, you're certainly welcome to pose those to me. Otherwise, I'm going to let us get going. Mr. Jacques, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, distinguished members of the committee, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We are pleased to be here to support your study on Canada's Defence Industrial Strategy. And with me today, I have our office lead, Christopher Penny. He's Senior Advisor and Office Lead on the Defence file.
A mandate to provide impartial, independent analysis to help you fulfill your constitutional role of holding government accountable. Our office prepares reports and analysis on the fiscal implications of Canada's defence spending and major procurement programs. In May 2022, we published our independent assessment of the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, an analysis of contractor obligations and fulfillment. This report analyzes transactions and investments under the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, that's also known as the ITB policy, for Canadian defence and security procurement. Based on our analysis, we found that transactions under this policy for the period of 2015 to 2019 total $18.3 billion. Of this amount, we find that almost half relate to transactions that are not directly related to the production of military equipment purchased by Canada. Furthermore, our analysis found that Canadian-owned firms accounted for about 1/3 of the total dollar value of ITB transactions with large partner firms. Nous répondrons maintenant à vos questions sur notre analyse de...
We'd be pleased to respond to any questions you may have regarding our analysis of the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy or other Parliamentary Budget Office work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacques. Okay, Mr. Guglielmin, the floor is yours for 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you both for being here today. Mr. Chakes, your economic and fiscal outlook doesn't include the NATO commitment of 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So your outlook didn't include the full picture of Canada's fiscal position, considering it not only didn't include the 5%, but also a large portion of the Liberal campaign promises?
I think it's important to look at the other side of what was also not included. So we also did not include the potential savings from the comprehensive expenditure review currently being undertaken by the government at this point. So that could potentially offset some of the additional fiscal costs that will be incurred by the government. And as well, with respect to the NATO 5%, something that I mentioned at the Government Operations Committee. Sorry, I'll be really quick. One of the major reasons why we didn't include the ramp up from 2% to 5% is that there is the potential for dual use infrastructure. So to the extent to which Canada is already spending on infrastructure that under the new NATO 5% commitment, that might be eligible as part of the new 5%. We don't know what that precisely looks like at this point.
So you also said some of your assumptions that you made around this were that the countermeasures that were in effect on September 5th would remain in place, and there were some assumptions that Canadian tariffs on goods from the U.S. will be gradually phased out. That's correct?
That's correct.
So, we learned today that not only we don't have a deal with the U.S. yet, and also out of the U.S. today, it said auto tariffs are going to remain in place. So this means potentially the outlook could be worse than anticipated.
It potentially could be worse. It could potentially be better. It's a very dynamic environment, and something.
Fair enough. So given that the federal deficit is projected to be $68.5 billion this year, and Canada has an unsustainable debt trajectory, as you had mentioned, even before accounting for the very much needed defense spending increase, to your knowledge, should Canadians at all be concerned that Canada might not be able to meet these important critical NATO defense commitments and potentially risk not keeping our commitments to our troops or our allies?
I think with respect to the key question of sustainability, the debt to GDP ratio for the country cannot rise in perpetuity. And what I pointed out at the Government Operations Committee was that this is the first time in a long time we've seen an upward trajectory for the debt to GDP ratio. And obviously the government's aware of that, and the government has space at this point to manage it. The key point, and I think the key takeaway that I highlighted, was it's a very challenging fiscal situation. And it's a very challenging fiscal situation owing in large part to factors outside of the government's control, to external factors outside of the country at this point, which, yes, absolutely raises concerns or raises challenges for the government to make really important trade-offs.
So given your stark warning that it's not a funny outlook, it's unsustainable, shocking, what concrete fiscal adjustments would you think the government might need to make so we can meet this very necessary and critical NATO defense spending? And what happens if we don't make the adjustments required, just from a purely fiscal perspective?
Well, I think as I mentioned at previous committees, generically there end up being two options for the government or any government around budgeting. You can make adjustments on the expense side, or you can make adjustments on the revenue side. But it does come down, fundamentally, it does come down to a question of trade-offs.
So cut spending or raise taxes?
In the same way that people would manage a household, and you can't buy everything you want, and you can't get everything you want, you have limited means. The government, like any household, is in the situation where they're going to have to make trade-offs, as Canadians need to make trade-offs.
So your report highlights that debt interest charges will cost the taxpayers $55.3 billion this year, already exceeding healthcare transfers. It'll rise to $82.4 billion by 2030. And if we add this very important and critical NATO spending on top of this, what effect would this have on debt servicing costs?
Well, it would obviously, if you spend more money without a commensurate increase on the revenue side, then potentially, you'd need to raise that money through debt financing. And if you raise it through debt financing, you're going to be paying higher debt interest costs. But again, something that I mentioned at the committee previously, it's a forecast. It's not the future. If I was perfectly clairvoyant, I would be retired on a Pacific island with a helicopter pad at this point. I'm not. And the mandate of the office is to ensure that we are putting numbers in the public domain and available to parliamentarians so they have a sense of what the status quo looks like.
Yeah.
And I'm very optimistic that the status quo will not come to pass.
Okay, so I want to ask a question related to our other study on capital flight and productivity. As mentioned, the federal deficit's now projected to reach $68.5 billion this year under Prime Minister Mark Carney. It's a significant jump from the $42.2 billion projected in the 2024 Fall Economic Statement under former Prime Minister Trudeau. At that time, the $42.2 billion, it was so alarming, the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, resigned over it. So what does this sharp increase to the deficit say about Canada's fiscal sustainability moving forward? Because that sustainability affects investment, business confidence, overall productivity in the market, and you'll have to be quick.
I think a large part of the deteriorating deficit situation is just a natural reflection of what happens when the economy hits a period of uncertainty and the labor market becomes more challenging and natural automatic federal supports kick into place. So people lose their jobs, unfortunately, and employment insurance is there to help them out and give them some sort of supports. And inversely, the flip side of that on the revenue side is people lose their jobs and they're not paying personal income taxes. So you would expect automatically to see the deficit situation deteriorate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gugelmin. Ms. Akan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jack, our government is making deliberate and targeted investments in Canada's strategic industries from clean technology to advanced manufacturing with the goal of building a more innovative and resilient economy. These are not short-term expenditures, but forward-looking investments designed to strengthen our industrial capacity and ultimately reinforce our long-term fiscal sustainability. Specifically, defense investments are critical to securing the safety of Canadians in a challenging global landscape, and which I believe you and fellow committee members are agree to that. So given that Canada continues to maintain one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios among the G7 economies, would you agree that Canada retains fiscal credibility and the necessary fiscal room to pursue these kind of strategic, growth-oriented and national defense investments, particularly when they are tied to innovation, long-term economic outcomes, and security of our nation?
Thank you for the question. I think in response to it, I would start with a quote from the 2024 Fall Economic Statement on page 38, which at that point indicated that the government is committed to its fiscal anchor to reduce the federal debt to GDP ratio over the medium term. This metric is key not only for fiscal sustainability, but also to preserve Canada's AAA credit rating, which helps maintain investors' confidence and keeps Canada's borrowing costs as low as possible.
So I'm asking specifically for defense investments because there are advanced manufacturers, engineering companies, aerospace and defense manufacturers in my riding of Oakville West. And that's why I would like to hear your input to this question on defense investment. Do you not agree that these investments are actually not the expenditures, but investments to bring jobs and bring more manufacturing to Canada or increase our productivity?
I would respond by saying that we haven't conducted such an analysis at our office to determine whether these investments are a net gain or a net loss, for instance. Of course, with any investment in the defense industry, you have to compare that against what could have been done with that money otherwise. Could it have been invested in social policies? Could it have been tax cuts? Could it have been anything else? So we haven't conducted a report on that, and so we wouldn't want to speak authoritatively in providing a response. Thank you.
So how can we ensure that we have the right metrics or measurements framework in place to evaluate the long-term outcomes of defense investments, not just in terms of immediate spending, but with respect to economic growth and productivity gains?
I would say that defense investments are included in our economic modeling thus far. It's certainly something we want to look at in more detail going forward. Of course, with the increased defense expenditures planned to reach 5% or 3.5% of actual defense and 1.5% ancillary defense by 2035, we want to know, people want to know what is going to be the economic impact of this increased defense expenditure. So, yes, we will certainly deign to model those economic impacts.
Thank you. So Canada's defense industry undertakes 3.4 times more research and development than the manufacturing sector and employs 2.5 times more STEM workers. So when modeling the economic impact of the defense industry strategy, what key assumptions are necessary to fully capture the productivity uplift associated with this high level of specialized research and development and capacity reuse, and how would these benefits compare to modeling conventional industrial or infrastructure spending, where research and development intensity may be lower?
I would say that it's a matter of course that investments in the defense sector would tend to have a greater, let's say, concentration of, for instance, STEM or other technologically oriented areas. But as mentioned, we haven't yet conducted a study on this topic. It is something that we would like to look into in greater detail.
I may be repeating myself here, but would you please answer, with Canada committed to increasing defense spending through the new defense industry strategy, what would the cost of inaction on this file be? How might an increased reliance on foreign supply, missed innovation opportunities, or an immature industrial supply chain impact Canadian opportunities and development in the coming years?
No, that's a very good question. It's perhaps the million-dollar question, actually. So one of the main reasons you want to invest in your domestic industry is to ensure security of supply in the event of a sustained conflict. Are we there yet? Remains to be seen. If you look at the munitions supply strategy, the MSP, the munitions supply program, only half of our munitions are supplied by Canadian firms. So certainly, you don't want to get into a situation where you enter into a conflict and you're unable to supply yourself. So yes, investments, you can make the argument, or one reasonable person could make the argument that investments are needed in these areas.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to see that you agree that the defense investment is a major item that we need to focus on now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Monsieur Saint-Marie, à vous 6 minutes.
Over to you, Mr. Saint-Marie. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Jacques, and Mr. Penny. Good afternoon, and thank you for having accepted to come before the committee today on the question of defence and the defence industrial strategy. Before I put more specific questions, Mr. Jacques, I'd like to have your opinion on what follows. There's a government announcement that on the 4th of November the budget will be tabled, and they've said that there will be expenditure at record levels. We talk about around 100 billion often, but there will be a new accounting approach where government operational expenditures will be very contained, and almost most of this will be put into another category. So have you looked at the Minister of Finance and also the government announcements about this new accounting approach? And where do you think the military spending will be put with this new approach? And what are your comments on that subject? Thank you very much for those questions. Yes, we saw the announcement yesterday, and we are happy to see that the government has indicated that there won't be a change as regards current indicators. When we talk about the debt to GDP and the deficit ratios and everything that we've seen in the past will continue. But at the same time, the government has announced that, as you've explained, there will be a different way of looking at the budget, with the operational budget on one hand, on investments on the other hand. This already exists in Quebec and in other provinces in Canada. But as we indicated yesterday, there's a question of a rather different definition put forward by the government for the investment budget, which would only exist here in Canada, and that'd be something rather idiosyncratic. And that is a cause for concern for us. And I think for parliamentarians, it would be advantageous to use an obvious, clear approach for all of the parliaments that has already existed, instead of reinventing something completely new. And then on defence spending, I think in the light of the announcement yesterday and with the defence infrastructure, it will be included in the capital budget. But there are still some pending conceptual questions about the increase in productivity with some military weapons. But when it comes to the accounting approach, I think that's how it's going to play out. So just to make sure I've quite understood, all of the military spending would be considered as investment spending rather than as part of the operational budget? Not all of them is the answer. Only in the situation where the government buys certain goods or assets. Thank you very much for that explanation. So, if in the budget on the 4th of November we have a 100 billion deficit, what about the fiscal headroom for Canada? What will be our fiscal headroom for these new defence spending programs in this context if we hit a deficit of 100 billion? And what will be the consequences of that? Answer. Well, for us, it is difficult to predict because 100 billion is a big figure, but it's only one single figure. And for us, it's perhaps more important to look at the other figures. 100 billion for the year to come is a high amount, but it's more important to look at the forecasts for the other years and the management approach with the fiscal framework for the future. So it is difficult at this point in time to comment because you've identified military spending, but there's other important sources of revenue. It's difficult to calculate the revenue and the expenditure side. Thank you. That's very clear. Now, according to you, the incremental investments in defence, do you think that will have a knock-on effect on other government priorities, given the flexibility? Of course, it's always a question of decisions. Money is not an infinite resource. And as we ourselves have to take decisions with their own personal budget, the Government of Canada and the provinces and Canadians have to do exactly the same exercise. Thank you very much. And now a question for Mr. Penny. About a year ago, you published the financial repercussions of meeting this military spending target set by NATO. So could you draw out the main issues of concern that were covered in that report that you'd like to raise before the committee today?
It is perhaps somewhat ironic to bring up that report, which is now completely moot, as we're now aiming to hit 5% and not 2%. In that report, we found that there would be some violations of the then, I guess, the fiscal anchors that were in place at that time, which is debt to GDP decreasing and deficit to GDP being under 1%. We found that, according to that study, that it would violate the deficit to GDP, and there would be some period of increasing debt to GDP under those assumptions. With the 5%, I am happy to, I guess, broadcast or advertise that we are working on a new report that will ascertain the fiscal impact of reaching 3.5% of defense spending plus 1.5% ancillary defense spending by 2035.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur Saint-Marie. Madame.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Saint-Marie.
And thank you, Mr. Jacques and Mr. Penny, for being with us today. As you know, this committee is also studying the productivity decline and capital outflow that Canada has been experiencing, unfortunately, for quite some time. And certainly, as you know, on top of these long-standing economic issues in Canada, we're also experiencing a bit of an economic slowdown. In fact, the government's own numbers, as you're well aware, are predicting a decline of 1.6% in real GDP in 2025. And certainly, at least some of that decline can be attributed to the tariff war. And certainly, I think everyone agreed that we needed to punch back against what we see as unfair trade practices from the United States with counter tariffs. But what I've been able to find is sort of the magnitude of those counter tariffs. So, are you aware of how much revenue the Canadian government has accumulated from those counter tariffs? Can you provide a number?
I have a number. Unfortunately, it's back at the office right now. I would say the government's been relatively transparent about providing numbers on counter-tariff revenue. They publish a monthly fiscal monitor by the Department of Finance. So the details are provided within that document, but I'd be happy to furnish the precise number back to the committee, and I know that we have an estimate for the current fiscal year for 2025, 2026. Sadly, I did not anticipate there'd be so much interest in our economic
Thank you.
and fiscal outlook.
Yes, I did see in the Globe and Mail, it was just south of $1 billion, but we saw some other numbers in the spring from the Carney government that they were over $1 billion. So I'm wondering if you can provide an update, just and even a general number. Is it more than $1 billion? Is it $5 billion? Is it 10?
I could, and I always get into trouble when I speculate. So I'll get back to the committee.
Can you
with that
confirm
number.
if it's 20 billion or near 20 billion? Because that's a number that you would remember, I would think.
It is based upon, so the number 20 billion was floated in the spring, and it was something that we looked at in anticipation of the counter tariffs that have been announced by the government being in place as announced for the full year. And then I think, as everyone's aware, those counter tariffs have been removed slowly over time. So we're well below the 20 billion mark at this point.
So from the numbers that we saw, it's perhaps $1 billion to $2 billion. That's what I had seen. That was the most recent numbers I was able to get. But you're saying it may be more, but it's certainly not 20 billion as you've outlined. So I appreciate that. But I did also want to ask about if you're aware how much has been remitted to businesses since then, because we did hear that there were promises that these counter tariff measures from businesses paying on those imports from the United States, that those would be given back to workers and businesses. Do you have a number for that?
I do have a number, and sadly, it's back at the office right now. I apologize.
That's no problem. So perhaps if you could commit to sending those figures to us, that would be great. Because it's my understanding that from the Canadian Federation for Independent Business, well over half of their members, which is 100,000 members, half of their members who have applied have not heard. So out of their members who have applied for counter tariff measures, half of
order,
those
Mr. Chair?
have not heard back.
Sorry, Madame Dancho, just stop the clock for a minute. Yes, Madame O'Rourke.
So I'm just wondering, I understand it's of interest, but
there a standing
we
order
are
violating,
speaking
Mr.
about
Chair?
Sorry.
defense industrial strategy.
One sec, I'll get back to it. Point of order requires me to address the member who's raised it. I was just trying to understand what her argument was, so if you just give me 1 sec, Madame Dancho. Madame O'Rourke, if I understand correctly, you're raising a point of order on a question of relevance?
Precisely.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, we're here to have a conversation about the defense industrial strategy. I understand that that can encompass a wide array of affairs. I hope that in our line of questioning we can get to some specifics that, even if not at the outset directed toward the defense industrial strategy, will ultimately help us understand how it connects to it. But Madame Dancho, I pause the clock. I'll return the floor to you with a minute 57 remaining.
Point of order, if I may. So when we were consulted on whether we can bring the PBO, my understanding was from our Bloc Québécois member, it was for both studies. So if that's my mistake, but we did have conversations, I believe, with the clerk, but perhaps there's been a miscommunication, but I would not have agreed unless he could have come to speak to both. So perhaps the compromise is that he be invited back promptly to speak exclusively about productivity and capital outflow, if the committee, because otherwise we would not have agreed. So either I can continue my line or we can have him back real soon.
I think that for the purposes of efficiency of this discussion, with 2 minutes remaining in your line of questioning, let's just allow you to complete that. And if I hear anything that concerns me about the direction, I'll intervene at that point.
Thank you. I could loop this certainly to defense industrial strategy because, of course, a lot of our SMEs produce things that the Canadian military would be happy to buy and does buy. So it does certainly impact them because they are, of course, importing many goods from the United States to manufacture into things that are Canadian made. In fact, a very large part of our businesses in this country bring in goods from the United States. I think it's 51% of SMEs bring goods in from the United States. Many of them have experienced reduced profit margins, layoffs, very serious consequences, of course, from what the U.S. is doing, but of course our countermeasures. We understood we had to punch back very hard. I think everyone supports that. But what was promised in the spring is that those counter tariffs collected from Canadian businesses importing those American goods to build Canadian goods, the Liberal government promised that that money would be remitted to those businesses and workers. And what we're hearing on the ground is that is not happening. So I would like confirmation of the numbers that that the Liberal government has taken and what's been remitted, because I think it's very important that at a time where we're seeing massive capital outflow, businesses closing, moving to the United States, layoffs, we need to ensure that we're holding the government accountable to the promises that they made to ensure these businesses are being helped out. And I unfortunately don't see a lot of evidence of that. So I appreciate your time and look forward to that data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Madame O'Rourke, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Carr. So just a quick question around dual use. Obviously, many of our projects of national interest will also be about our sovereignty and our defense. Things like runways, investments in ports, digital perhaps, a lot of defense in the Arctic. So how do you approach that from a finance perspective in terms of the ROI, in terms of mapping out what is a defense spend? So are these double counted? So can you just help me understand what the approach is on these dual use investments that will in fact unlock more work if there's a longer runway in the Arctic? So how do we approach that?
Sure. No, it's an excellent question. It's been a bit of a curveball, to be honest, to understand that there is this added 1.5% as part of the 5% that is going towards these, security of supply, ancillary, critical minerals, cyber, the things you've referred to. And it's actually not at all clear that these would necessarily be incremental to current spending. It may be that we're already at 1.5%. We've interfaced with the Department of National Defense to understand what exactly the definition is for the 1.5% ancillary spending. They've duly provided us information. They don't have an estimate of how much we actually have at this moment. Our analysis going forward will include, of course, an estimate of spending under that rubric.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Jacques, you said in your opening remarks we're in a very challenging period. Just last week, we heard from an ADM at the Department of National Defense and also the Chief of the Royal Canadian Air Force and Space Force Development that we are not in peacetime. And so there's an urgency, both at home and abroad, to meet our NATO commitments to rearm and equip our military. At the same time, we're facing the tariffs that are not in our control. We're looking at investing in major projects, training folks for trades, and investing in housing, and setting aside funds for EI and other social programs in the event that there's a larger tariff impact. So I'm wondering, in your assessment, are these situational expenses at this moment in time? How are they offset by returns on those investments, as certainly there will be? Or is this a structural issue that we need to address in the longer term? I would add as well, there's no ability to wait, particularly on the defense spending.
Yeah, it certainly, given the mandate of our office, it's not our place to judge policy or the decisions the government makes on what they want to spend on and when they want to spend on it. It's our job and it's our mandate to simply calculate the numbers and present it to parliamentarians in a neutral and independent way. With respect to the return on investment or the economic benefits of the investment, that's something, as my colleague, Mr. Penny, mentioned previously, that's something that is explicitly taken into account as part of, within our macroeconomic model, as part of the overall numbers for growth when we see additional government investment. With respect to the spending and whether, I guess, with respect to the longer term spending and getting back to a point I made to Monsieur Samary, the major issue is not what happens in the next 1 year or 2 years. The major question is what years 3, 4, and 5 look like. So what we've seen in the past, and going back to all the recent reports from the International Monetary Fund and the OECD, the advice is be aware that for most governments around the world, public debt is going up, and it's a major challenge, and it needs to be managed carefully. So that's a common challenge that everyone faces. And the issue, or I guess the major concern and the challenge that the government needs to solve at this point is certainly we'll see a short-term economic shock, but where do we end up over the longer term? And just mathematically, there does come a point where the economy has to grow in such a way in which it generates enough revenue to pay for the goods and services that Canadians expect and enjoy.
Great. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that most governments around the world are facing similar situations, because what it does is it broadens the lens and allows us to see that they're global shocks and not strictly in Canada. So I appreciate that. What metrics would you suggest we put in to analyzing the success of the defense industrial strategy?
That's a very good question, of course. I believe I've said that for most questions I've received. But I would say that in terms of metrics to assess whether, the defense industrial strategy is working, I would think that looking at delivery timelines would be certainly one of them. Cost overruns, of course. These are things we're always concerned with. But to know whether investments are being effective, are effective, is kind of a difficult thing. One of the metrics that's been used in the past is to look at whether a firm that has received, say, in the case of our ITB report, have they received, ITB economic activity, do they continue exporting, for instance? If they're wrapped into a global supply chain as a result of investments, that certainly would be something you could point to as being successful.
Thanks, Mme. Rourke. We're over time here. Mr. Saint-Marie, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Penny, a few years ago, you worked on the ITB policy in the defence and security sectors. Could you summarise the main elements that came out of your study back then? And with what's announced, what do you think we should be addressing as parliamentarians now?
Study
Sorry. Mike.
the FSA in the in the introduction. Apologies for not answering in French. But I would say that my read of the situation is that only 30% of the firms involved in ITBs are Canadian. Of the remaining firms, 63, I believe it's about 60 or 63% are American-owned. And the stated goals of the policy are to, among other things, there are many things. I want to look at, research and development, like enhancing research and development and helping out small and medium enterprises. With regards to the latter point, only 12% of the total economic activity goes to small and medium enterprises. So this would be something that I think should be of interest, though that's my opinion. Going forward, in terms of analysis, in terms of what I think or what we think should be done or should be analyzed, is looking at what is the premium associated with the industrial and technological benefits program. So we buy something from a foreign country and we require them to invest in Canada. These other firms, they're not stupid. Of course, they factor in that requirement into the cost of what they're selling us. So to answer the question of whether this policy is effective, whether it's actually helping our industry, we have to compare that against how much we're saving or how much we're having to spend.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, if we look at the expenditure, there's lots of imports. So would you say that companies in Canada and the defence sector export as much? Is this offset, or is there more of a trade deficit in this area?
It's an excellent question. Unfortunately, our study did not cover exactly what is the breakdown between exportation and importation under the ITB policy, but it is something I can see that would be very important too.
Excuse me, Monsieur
Merci beaucoup.
Malheureusement.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, you have no time left.
Mr. Falk, floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Mr. Jackson and Mr. Penny for your attendance here at committee. Just to confirm a few things, the $68 billion deficit that you're projecting, does that include or anticipate the 2% military spending? Defense spending?
It does.
It includes that?
Based upon the numbers that we have within our 5-year outlook, in the next year it rounds to 2%.
Okay. Yeah. And have you at all factored in a model of if we were to reach the 5%?
No, we're working on that right now.
Okay.
So stay tuned. There's keen interest by many parliamentarians.
Okay. And just following up a little bit on Mr. St. Marie's line of questioning there, the government has signaled that they're looking at presenting our finances in a different format. and at a different time in year. Those are flags to me when things like that. They're wanting to move more to a capital asset type reporting system and income and expense. Have you looked at all at that model?
Yeah, we have. So yesterday morning, we published our initial take on what the government has proposed and has in mind. It's kind of I would say, broadly speaking, it's a mixed bag. There are some aspects where we think it's really a win for Parliament, and especially looking at the timing side. So moving the budget up to earlier in the year ensures that something that all parliamentarians over the 20 years that I've been on the Hill have complained about, and that's the lack of integration between the main estimates document and the budget. That allows that to actually happen.
Fiscal reporting periods wouldn't change.
No, the fiscal, from the reporting period perspective, it won't change. Moving the documents up is also a good international practice. It's something that the IMF and the OECD have recommended, because previously we would have a situation where the budget would be tabled potentially after the fiscal year had started, and the main estimates would be tabled very close to the beginning of the fiscal year, but they wouldn't actually incorporate any of the measures in the budget.
Would you also then anticipate a new line in the reporting of depreciation?
Yeah, but in terms of the shift, the government's announcement of enhancing or adding additional metrics that they're going to provide on the operating and capital side, again, I go back to everything we've seen before, everything that was published previously will continue to be published. And that was the first concern for us, and something that we are really pleased to see that the government is committed, that we're not losing anything. On the operating and capital side, again, like on the capital budget, it is a unique made in Canada at the federal government level approach, which I think for most accountants kind of gives you a bit of a pause when the federal government is coming up with a brand new way of presenting capital budgeting when there are 10 Canadian provinces that are already doing it along with other municipalities. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it reminds me of that saying that figures don't lie, but liars know how to figure, right? And that's the first thing, that's a flag that comes up for me when they're changing the reporting modeling.
I would say, and something I mentioned before, I would say the government has indicated that this is how they're making decisions internally, like on the capital side and the operating side. So we're very much restraining the growth in operating spending. Historically, it's been growing at 9% a year. The target now is to take it down to around 2% and to shift to continue to grow capital spending. I would, from my own perspective, if the government was not sharing that information with parliamentarians, if they had a new way of making decisions inside government and they weren't communicating that to the public, the first thing I would say is, A, it's not transparent, it's problematic, please share your internal deliberations and how you make decisions with the public. So I think from that perspective, it's definitely transparent.
They've also been using different terminology now. They're doing deficit to GDP as opposed to debt to GDP. Are there any other jurisdictions reporting it differently now, like that as well?
Well, the choice of fiscal...
Certainly a departure from what we've been used to.
Yeah, it's definitely... It's a departure from what we've seen in the past. I'd say over the past 40 years, the debt to GDP anchor, and as I recited earlier, the declining debt to GDP anchor has been a cornerstone of the government's fiscal anchors. Okay. So, and regardless of the stripe of government that you're looking at.
What is the fiscal anchor then, right?
Well, I would say that thankfully the Minister of Finance was at committee yesterday and he identified 2 fiscal anchors. Okay. So balancing the operating budget over 3 years and a declining deficit to GDP ratio over the medium-term horizon. Okay. He conspicuously did not mention the debt to GDP anchor. Although I would say on September 17th, I have the quote right here from the Prime Minister, he did indicate that one of the fiscal anchors is a declining level of debt. Overall, at that point, I presumed he meant debt to GDP. Right. But obviously, there are a lot of things in flux.
Okay. One more question?
I'm sorry, Mr. Fault, we're 30 seconds over, so apologies. Thank you. Mr. Bardizzi, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to focus my questions on the defense industrial policy study that we're doing, and I want to pick up the thread on a few of the threads that Mr. Samedi and Mr. Falk laid. So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that you're going to give some guidance on capital versus operating more generally. Specifically with respect to defense procurement, we know that there is going to be a need for hardware procurement, but we also know that the defense sector is changing and that software procurement, I think, is probably going to be a bigger part of defense procurement going forward. And so software procurement has capital-like features, but it's not it's not goods that you can point to. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to how software procurement in defense spending might be treated, what your thinking is on that.
I can say that, so our office does track capital spending by national defense and as of recently, the Coast Guard. We are not enabled by the legislation to release any information that the department doesn't allow us to release. So we can't talk about specific projects. We have a capital spending report that is going to come out later this month, most likely. I think I might have just painted us into a corner, but yeah, we're planning on releasing it later this month. We don't parcel out the different aspects of capital spending, other than perhaps we'll look at the different, what we call environments, so Army, Navy, Air Force, joint. But there will probably not be a separate software capital section for that.
A couple questions on ITBs, and again, Mr. Saint-Marie was asking about these. You mentioned, so in the summary brief, you mentioned 30% Canadian firms accounted for in the past study. Are there benchmarks, other countries that have policies that are similar to ITBs? Is there an objective we should be aiming for?
Towards an objective, I can say, however, that virtually every developed country levies some type of program. We call them pretty generally those of us who are nerdy enough to call ourselves defense economists, we call them trade offsets or defense offsets. Yeah, every country engages in this, or most countries engage in this. And I wouldn't speak to any sort of benchmarks that would say it's better or worse.
Is it fair to assume that a greater proportion of Canadian firm involvement in ITBs going forward could lead to greater tax revenue in the revenue calculations that you're looking at?
I see nothing objectionable about that statement.
And I know it's sometimes, governments like to talk about the potential potential revenue uplifts from all kinds of policies, but I think it's important to put on the record that you've already identified that defense spending has a multiplier effects that are perhaps greater than other forms of spending.
As I said, it's one of the things we're going to be studying more in future. But yes, of course, our economic modeling, as myself and Mr. Jakes have mentioned before, do take into account a multiplier effect of investments in defense.
Do you now, and a couple of my colleagues have spoken to this, but I want to maybe see if there's more point that can be put on it. There is a cost of not acting, and there is a potential fiscal cost of not acting in defense procurement or national security more generally. In the world that you occupy, and in defense economists in particular, how do they think about that? Whether even if it wasn't something that they would publish with numbers, can you just talk to us a bit about how those kinds of things are discussed?
When it comes to the study of defense in economics, one of the things that's really hard to measure is the output. What is the output, right? I mean, the output is we get to have a country, right? We're able to protect ourselves. We're able to, seriously. So it's not like, we have a capability for tanks, for instance, or fighter aircraft or something like that. Well, how much is that worth? How do you put a price tag on that? So, essentially it's one of the primary confounding things in that area of study.
Do you have time for more?
Yeah. Okay, colleagues, because we ran, we're a little bit under time. We don't have time for a full round, but I'm going to go with Monsieur Saint-Marie, 2 minutes 30 seconds, and then I'm going to go to the Conservative.
So 2 minutes 30 for Mr. Saint-Marie. Please go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair. The U.S. President, every time when he meets with the Canadian Prime Minister, he talks about the Golden Dome Protection Project. The Golden Dome Shield. So, Mr. Penny, based on your knowledge, if Canada was partially funding this type of protection system for the two countries, what could the economic benefits be, or what would the financial impact be for the federal government and for the Canadian economy in general?
To say, especially at this sort of nascent phase where this project has been announced, and we've seen the media reportings about it, but we don't really know what's going into it. We don't know how much we're going to pay. Certainly, we're for better or for worse, we're intertwined with the United States via NORAD and NATO. Those investments, certainly for NORAD, will continue apace regardless. I can't comment. We obviously haven't looked at the Golden Dome itself and what exactly that entails for the Canadian economy.
Oui, très bien. On a le nom, mais le reste.
So we've got the name, but the details remain to be revealed. So if it comes to defence material exports from Canada to the US, and if these exports were covered by extra tariffs, is that an element that you could model to show the impact on public finances here and the impact on the Canadian economy?
To look at that in real time, of course, in terms of modeling and using data, the tariffs are very new, and it would take some time for us to really ascertain exactly what the impact has been. And as I mentioned before, 63% of ITB dollar value comes from American-owned firms. So would they be levying tariffs on those? Honestly, we haven't studied that in great detail as of yet.
Mais je vous remercie beaucoup. Je crois que
Thank you very much. I think that the US government would be capable of deciding to impose tariffs on its own companies that are producing things in Canada.
Saint-Marie. Madame,
Thank you, Mr. Summit.
30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about the Defence Procurement Agency. We know, of course, Canada has a considerable issue with our procurement process in the military. It takes a very long time for us to procure the equipment we need. So I just would like to know if you have a budget number for this new agency, or is it going to be an amalgamation from existing department apparatus? It's my understanding, of course, we have a very large bureaucracy that is in charge of procurement now. So is this within that, or will it be additional to that? And do you have a budget figure for that at all?
Our most recent economic and fiscal outlook was finalized before that announcement occurred, so we don't have figures on that.
Okay.
That said, we will be obtaining additional information from the government, so we'll be in a position to provide information to the committee within the coming weeks.
Okay, thank you. And I believe Mr. Falk has a question as well.
Hey, thank you, Raquel. Just as a follow-up question to the 2% of defense spending that you've included in your $68 billion projected deficit, does that include additional things like Coast Guard expenditures now?
Let's see. That's a good question. For this year, I don't think it does. Okay. The thing we need to understand is that Coast Guard expenditures were already included under the NATO definition of expenditures. So when they're saying $62 billion for this year, 2% of GDP, that already includes spending from other government departments, including Canadian Coast Guard. Now, Canadian Coast Guard has moved under national defense, which means I'm speculating at this point, but I think that means some of the administrative costs, some of the civilian areas of CCG would be included now in the definition, because under the NATO definition, your defense ministry, everything counts essentially as far as civilians are concerned. So I suspect that adding CCG will increase just by virtue of accounting defense spending. But it shouldn't be part of that figure, though, because those figures were released before CCG.
Okay. And is that something your department will be monitoring or auditing? Or?
We are coming out with reports on a yearly basis on NATO defense spending. Yeah.
Okay. Are you aware of any other areas where the government is reclassifying expenditures into defense to meet that 2% target?
My understanding is that every year National Defense sends some of their civilian members to other government departments to figure out how much exactly how much spending would fit under the NATO definition of military expenditure. And so at the end of the year, they have basically line items showing for this department over here, RCMP, there's X billion dollars. There's Coast Guard, X billion dollars, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. Mr. Baines, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on publicly available data, can your office estimate regional and sectoral benefits from defense procurement? For example, in my home province of British Columbia, the National Shipbuilding Strategy is underway. Would you be able to talk about jobs or how much output per dollar, the impacts compared to conventional infrastructure or industrial spending?
That's a perfectly fair question. I would say that ISED would be the department you'd want to speak to in terms of evaluating, regional benefits or, economic activity that occurs in certain areas. It's not something we've looked at. Of course, our mandate is to look at things that are of particular importance to nation's finances. Arguably not inside our mandate, but yeah.
Okay. Another question. In addition to Canada's security and sovereignty, the Defence Industrial Strategy is expected to bring domestic industrial benefits such as careers, innovation. For example, according to a study by Desjardins, $1 of defense spending leads to 1.2 in nominal GDP once direct or indirect and induced effects are accounted for. So can you maybe tell us what assumptions are needed to model productivity around it?
In terms of, sorry, just to clarify the question in terms of modeling productivity.
Yeah, for example, innovation and capacity reuse.
So as Mr. Penny indicated, we do, within our existing modeling, we do take into account increasing, both the public sector and private sector investment, of which national defense would be included as part of it. So we already have the data available, and it's something that we're following and tracking.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. A productive meeting. Thank you to our witnesses for making yourselves available today and providing insight on the study in relation to the Defense Industrial Strategy, which is a big component of what we are setting time aside for over the course of the next few months. So thank you again. Colleagues, we are going to briefly suspend in order to turn over to the second half of our meeting today. Commencer. We're going to get into the second hour. We've got three witnesses with us today, two here and one online. So I just would like to let members know that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting. For our witnesses, there will be up to, and I stress up to, 5 minutes for introductory remarks, at which point we will get into a line of questioning with a predetermined allocated time for members of each affiliated party around the table. We have with us Alexander Salt from Triple Helix, a postdoctoral fellow. We have from Acme Testing and Consulting, Richard Borger, and from U15 Canada, Robert Asselin, the Chief Executive Officer. Monsieur Asselin, on va commencer avec vous, juste parce que...
So we'll start with you, Mr. Asselin. I believe that you're online, and if you're ready, you have 5 minutes, sir, starting now. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much for inviting me to appear before you today. My name is Robert Asselin, and I serve as CEO of U15 Canada. We represent Canada's 15 leading research universities, and our institutions conduct more than 75% of all university research in Canada. We enroll 70% of the country's full-time doctoral students and generate much of the nation's innovation, whether we're talking about patents or private sector research contracts or major scientific discoveries. And collectively, our universities are a national strategic asset. They are the foundations and the pillars of talent, research, and innovation in Canada. Today, we're living through a profound transformation in the global economy. The era of unfettered trade, the belief whereby open markets would always guarantee stability and prosperity, is now over. Around the world, we are seeing the return of economic coercion. Supply chains are being weaponized. Access to technologies is being restricted, and nations are redefining prosperity through the lens of security. In this new era, economic and national security are inseparable. The long-term competition among nations is now about how they can compete and win in advanced industries.
Rick Schmidt, Special Competitive Studies Project puts it, innovation power, the ability to invent, adopt, and integrate technologies at scale is now the foundation of both prosperity and security. And as former U.S. Ambassador Rahm Emanuel recently wrote, industrial policy can only succeed if it rests on a deep and sustained base of advanced research. History offers powerful lessons on how existential threats can drive transformation. In 1957, the launch of Sputnik was a shock to the United States. The response was not incremental, it was transformational. President Eisenhower created DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA's innovation, GPS, the internet, and more became the backbone of U.S. economic and technological dominance. In 1962, President Kennedy went to Rice University to deliver his famous moon speech and called for a national mission to lead in science and technology. Crucially, they placed their leading research universities at the center of that effort. NASA's partnership with Caltech became a vibrant model for what alignment between government, academia, and industry can achieve. It turned scientific excellence into national capability and produced spillovers in robotics, materials, communications, and defense that still shape the world today. Canada now stands at a similar inflection point. Our leading research universities, the U15, are among the best in the world. They produce extraordinary talent and cutting-edge discoveries. Yet, too often, our breakthroughs are scaled elsewhere because we lack a coordinated strategy linking discovery to deployment and research strength to industrial advantage. That gap, the failure to connect our research power to national purpose, has been the Achilles heel of Canada's industrial policy. The creation of Borealis, Canada's new defense innovation platform, offers a way to change that. It can be our version of DARPA, a vehicle to translate advanced research into deployable technologies for the Canadian Armed Forces and for advanced industries. Mais nous devons agir avec...
But we must execute boldly and with determination. We have to better connect the full chain talent and intellectual capital, foundational research, commercialization, public procurement. Advanced industries are not only drivers of productivity, they are also the building blocks of national security. Canada cannot afford to remain a passive adopter and user of foreign technologies.
The United States, our scale is different, but scale is not the lesson. The lesson is alignment. When research excellence, receptive industrial capacity, and predictable procurement work together, sovereign capabilities follow. If we get that alignment right, we will strengthen our security, drive innovation, and build the technological foundations of Canada prosperity for decades to come. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Very well done, Mr. Assin. Exactly 5 minutes on the nail.
Dr. Salt, we'll turn the floor over to you for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank the Chair and members for inviting me to speak today on what is an incredibly important issue. In my opening remarks, I will make a couple observations about the evolving state of Canada's defence industrial ecosystem, and finally make a few recommendations that you may want to examine for further study. The evolving international security environment, marked by rising geopolitical tensions and Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, has underscored the urgent need for Canada to develop a coherent national defence industrial strategy. Such a strategy must go beyond rhetoric to modernize Canada's approach and align our defence and dual-use innovation ecosystems and ensure that they can be mobilized for real strategic effect. Canada's security and economic resilience increasingly depends on our ability to harness this integrated ecosystem with purpose, speed, and focus. Advanced technologies such as AI, robotics, cloud networks, biotech, and quantum computing, among others, are holding increasing relevancy to modern military operations, as well as Canadian defence. What sets the current generation of emerging tech apart from traditional 20th century defence technologies, like tanks and fighter jets, is their origins, in that historically conventional military hardware has typically been designed and manufactured by major defense contractors, while today it is civilian technological startups, often at the small, medium enterprise level, that are driving tech innovation. Many of these startups are creating technology with dual-use application, meaning they hold utility to both militaries as well as the civilian economy. These dual-use technologies are also developed at a much more rapid pace than how traditional government procurement processes can handle. Simply put, the status quo of how Canada identifies and acquires new military technology is likely ill-suited to ensure that the military maintains access to strategically vital emerging technologies, and unless this is fixed, the military will be outpaced by allies and adversaries alike. Accepting risk and prioritizing speed must become a much larger component of how Canadian defence operates. Now, in terms of a few recommendations, firstly, the government needs better data. To sustain an effective defence industrial strategy, it will require a much better understanding of the small, medium enterprise ecosystem within Canada, including what firms are out there and where they are located. The government needs to better define how it characterizes dual-use firms. Further, there likely needs to be a better understanding of what constitutes a sovereign Canadian company, especially when it comes to multinational corporate structures. Secondly, to meet the needs of small and medium enterprises, Canada should consider establishing alternative funding mechanisms to help streamline investment in dual-use startups. This could include the establishment of a not-for-profit venture capital fund. Canadian allies, such as the US, UK, and Australia, are starting to demonstrate that this approach can be effective at driving technological innovation. There is an attractiveness to forming a publicly funded venture capital fund, which could help streamline defence tech investments, but also can allow the government and military to shape the research and development cycles of the startups involved. Third, existing innovation mechanisms, such as the IDEAS program, are in need of aggressive reform or replacement. Transforming IDEAS into a formal defence accelerator institution, similar to those currently in operation in the UK and Australia, would likely enhance the program's effectiveness by lessening the focus on competition over grants and allowing more opportunities for direct contracting to occur. Fourth and finally, Canada should diversify its international defence industrial partnerships and explore forming new research and development agreements with other countries on matters relating to emerging technologies. These initiatives would help diversify and strengthen the Canadian defence industrial base, help accelerate the integration of emerging technologies within the military, and potentially expand the export market opportunities for certain sovereign defence products. Thank you.
You're setting quite the standard here, witnesses. Mr. Borger, I think the pressure's on you now, sir, but you have upwards of 5 minutes.
Yes, very much
Yeah,
so.
take
Thank you, Mr.
Take your time as needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the rest of the members of this committee. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to present to you tonight. I believe I have a unique perspective to provide suggestions on how the defence industrial strategy can be leveraged to regenerate and further develop sovereign capabilities of Canada's industrial ecosystem and procurement opportunities for Canadian businesses. In the past several years, I have provided in situ testing and objective evaluation on the functionality of several innovations that were processed through the Innovative Solutions Canada testing stream. Additionally, since 2023, I've been the Secretary of the Innovation Centre of the North, one of Canada's recently established NATO Diana testing centres. This experience, coupled with being the director of a small Canadian business, has provided me with a rather unique lens to provide suggestions to this committee. Based on this experience, I've provided 5 suggestions for this committee to consider as you frame the defence industrial strategy to ensure the most benefit for Canadian businesses. These suggestions include a review and reinvigorate the Innovation Solutions Canada testing stream with a committed intent to normalize the use of third-party evaluators, increase utilization of the NATO Diana testing centres, repeal the industrial and technological, or ITB, policy, implement dynamic procurement strategies for defence procurement, and promote an innovation-forward mandate for all members of the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces. I've attempted to provide context to each of these items and present evidence-based suggestions for the implementation that will provide immediate support for Canada's industrial ecosystem in the brief that I provided to the committee. I look forward to further discussion on this matter. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Look at that. We should have brought you for the entire discussion on productivity. Your introduction in and of itself could have been a great standard to set for us. Okay, colleagues, we've got some time to play with. Madame Dancho, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I have questions for Mr. Asselin. You mentioned in your opening remarks, certainly, that universities are a strategic asset, and I very much agree with you. And of course, you are the CEO of U15 Canada, which is really our top Canadian academic institutions, our universities. So very well done on that, and we're looking forward to your testimony, pardon me. And I've done a lot of reading of things that you've published in recent years, so I'd like to ask you a bit about that. You had written that economic security and national security are now inseparable, and that Canada's longstanding failure has been, quote, linking discovery to deployment and research strength to industrial advantage. And I do feel that this is a core issue that this committee needs to be seized with concerning the defence industrial policy that we're looking to make recommendations on. So as you know, about, $3.7 billion come from the federal government to our universities for research and development. There's also quite a bit of research and development tax credits and innovation programs. But in my study of this department and of this funding, it doesn't seem to be that there's any coherent strategy behind this funding that certainly would be focused on, say, sovereignty and our critical industries. So I want to ask you a bit about that. In particular, you said Canada must build the sovereign capabilities and productive capacity that underpin our resilience for decades. Very well said. So do you feel that the taxpayer funding for research and development to universities and or private enterprise should have a more strategic focus on ensuring it's contributing to our critical industries and the development of them?
So great question. Obviously, the granting councils provide various sources of funding from very fundamental to more mission-driven. I will say that in the context of defense industrial strategy, we have not yet seen more targeted funding related to the objectives that we're discussing today. So we're hoping this will come in light of the upcoming budget with more intentionality. So Borealis right now is a vehicle that has been announced, but not really explained in details how it would for example, fund research and what mechanism it would use to transmit, this idea generation to corporations and commercialization and then public procurement. So that's really what we're hoping to see is the full continuum from research funding to public procurement. Yeah.
And you'd mentioned in some of your previous writing, you've warned that vague industrial policy objectives tend to yield underwhelming results. And, within that, you've also pointed to DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which, of course, clearly has been quite successful in contributing to their defense industrial strategy there. So if Canada were to build its own DARPA, would it be like this Borealis agency that you've alluded to?
I hope so, but everything will be in the execution of it.
Right, and what sort of metrics do you think we should be looking at to measure success?
Well, first, I think in the design of the institution, it's really important that it's not business as usual. So high risk, high reward, very focused on, the capabilities we're trying to build and link the research with the other parts of the innovation ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that DARPA has been so successful, it has been very targeted, and the way it functions as an agency is very nimble, very agile, not bureaucratic at all. So I hope that we will follow this model.
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, in the last number of months, I think Canadians have been quite seized with these sovereignty issues. I think it's quite timely that we're studying this defense industrial policy. Those are inextricably linked, in my opinion. And I guess my concern is that we do fund research and development, whether through our public institutions or private enterprise, to the tune of billions of dollars. And again, it just doesn't seem to be focused on the industries that secure our food supply necessarily, or our defense technologies, or our computing capacity, or our transportation or telecommunications. Some of that is funded, but it's almost by accident, it seems, rather than a coherent strategy for that. So if you could make a recommendation to the Minister of Industry, including the Minister of Defense perhaps, how would you advise them to evolve the way that we're funding research and development to our universities and private enterprise?
Well, in this case of defense, I think targeted to sovereign capabilities, clearly identify them, then fund the research that comes with it. I think it has also to be targeted to technology development. I think it's really important. If we want to own our own technology, we have to first design it through research, obviously, and ideas and intellectual capital. And then I would say we need a modern science technology architecture. Our architecture is from the post-World War of the 40s, things like the National Research Council. We have a lot of silos in the ecosystem that is not working together. I would hope that the government gets kind of its ducks in order and puts a modern science and science technology architecture for the world we live in.
Thank you very much. I think you were touching a little bit on this, but certainly on our IP. So we do invest in our research and development in our universities, but a lot of that IP, as you've written, goes to the south or to other foreign entities. Can you comment a bit on that and how we can ensure that we're keeping that IP, and of course in the defense and security sector would be great.
So I'm hoping that the public procurement part of the industrial strategy will be really helpful in solving this problem. So we have a problem of scale in our businesses, lots of SMEs who are not able to do enough R&D and are not able to scale and keep the IP in Canada because either sold in the US market or it fails eventually as a company. And so I'm hoping that public procurement, especially in the context of defense industrial strategy, will really help provide some certainty around those businesses that we want to scale and keep in Canada, including obviously the IP that we have developed in Canada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Dantro. Mr. Baines, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. I'll begin with Dr. Salt, if you will. In your work, The Future of Canadian Defence Involvement in the Indo-Pacific, you pose that Five Eyes members can move beyond just information sharing to fostering technological development and integration. What kind of partnerships and development opportunities do you think Canada, what strength does Canada have and what kind of role could they play?
Or
we play?
Certainly. So I think it's a lot easier to form partnerships in the emerging tech space than it is traditional, major defense procurements, because everybody has factories and everybody wants to not necessarily lose out on contracting. When it comes to emerging tech, you can have one side take care of the software, one side take care of the hardware component, and it's a lot easier to share information, especially around the world, in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries in that area. In terms of Canada's potential strengths, what it can bring to the table in potential future relationships here, artificial intelligence and robotics, right? Especially in the maritime domain. We have companies like Kraken Robotics in, I believe, Newfoundland, for example. These are world-known companies that are doing some really innovative tech. Our AI ecosystem in Ontario, in the Kitchener-Waterloo corridor, is internationally known. These are immediate strengths we could tap into in any sort of international defense partnership.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Mr. Borger. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen that there's a need for modern warfare, more development of new things like drones. It's beyond doubt that nations like Canada, we have to also adapt and procure these things. If you can sort of let me know what the software and the control systems that go along with that, is Canada positioned to develop these advanced systems when it comes to drones?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for the question. So I've worked with a number of drone manufacturers across the country, starting with Newfoundland, again, with Strobel Tech, right through to Pegasus down in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. Every single one of those companies, they all work with open source hardware and open source software, and actually modify that specifically for their command and control links for the drone technology that they're using. So there's actually a fairly wide spectrum of capabilities that can be leveraged, some of it open source and some of it very proprietary, and Canada is well positioned to actually develop that technology here in our country.
And what is the capital availability currently like for your sector within the country?
I'm sorry, that's outside of my expertise. Is it possible maybe to rephrase that question?
You mean finance?
Yeah, like financing, capital that's available right now, like private industry wise.
Yeah, excellent.
Maybe just a little bit further, like how much interest is there? How much private investment interest is there?
Excellent. So there's a significant amount of private interest in these companies. The challenge that a lot of these companies have is getting through that stage of prototype development to be able to attract venture capital to investments in their company. And that's why in the brief that I provided, one of the suggestions that I made was actually reallocating some of those ITB credits to increase the multiplier for investment in some of those SMBs to allow that development that is already of interest there, but allow that development to increase further until it reaches that private sector capital raise.
Thank you. And for Mr. Asselin, if you could, when it comes to Canadian universities, we have some of the most highly respected research institutions in the world. I know my colleague talked a little bit about that. How can the research from universities be better commercialized to enhance Canadian access to dual-use technologies and getting these technologies into market?
So this is at the core of the innovation problem we have in Canada. And I just want to be clear, our jobs as leading research universities is be excellent, and we are, at research. Our job is not to be corporate entities that commercialize our own research. And so in the ecosystem, we have to build that bridge that translates intellectual capital into commercial applications, both in services and products. And most countries have built these mechanisms. I think I spoke to the DARPA model. Borealis could play that function. But I want to emphasize the commercialization problem will not be solved by universities. It is not what they are designed to do. And so we have to build an innovation ecosystem that understands that, and I think that builds this bridge between leading research universities and the corporate world.
So you believe the focus should be on like research institutions or other entities that can create that strength in the domestic industrial base?
So basically, there are different steps, right? What I'm arguing today is that industrial strategy and industrial policy starts with talent and research, and then it has to be moved into commercialization and technological applications. And those functions are played by different players in the ecosystem. Universities will continue to be excellent at research, but other institutions need to play the role of translating these ideas into the corporate world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baines. Mr. Saint-Marie, 6 minutes.
Oui,
Mr. Saint-Marie, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all the witnesses. Thank you for your participation here today. First question for Mr. Aslan. Very interesting. I'll pick up on the subject that was raised by Mr. Baines. You've said that this is at the heart of the issue. How can we improve the link between research and innovation in the university world, and then how that's translated and applied in companies? And you've said that this is a block in Canada, an obstacle to improving productivity. So drawing all of your experience at a governmental level and also in the business world and at the university level, what can Ottawa do to improve this, in particular for the defence sector? Thank you very much for that question. I've got a great deal of hope in this new vehicle that's been created that's called Borealis, because that's the bridge we need between the research universities and then the corporate world to catalyze the research and turn it into tangible applications. And then at the end of the day, that means we can have a public purchaser, the Government of Canada, that would adopt these Canadian technologies. And that would help with our innovation and our productivity. So there's these different parts of the chain that are missing. After the ideas come out of the university, it's what happens next. They're stored in the patents, but we're not marketing them. We're not commercializing them because there's nobody in the ecosystem who's got a mandate to do this. I hope that Borealis will be able to really focus in on that particular aspect. Thank you. Could you explain in more detail exactly what Borealis is all about? Borealis is a scientific bureau that's been created. It's been announced by the Prime Minister at the University of Toronto a few months ago. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the government nor on behalf of the Department of National Defence, but I believe that the idea is to emulate the DARPA model that exists in the US. Namely, we want to use this bureau, this office, to try and direct things and come back to these issues that I mentioned. So to focus research on Canada's sovereign capabilities that we have not perhaps developed enough yet, and then commercialize all of that so that we can link this to public procurement. The government would become a purchaser, as is the case in the US. If you take companies such as Boeing and Lockheed Martin, they didn't become multinationals just because they were very good at what they were doing. No, it was in particular because institutions such as DARPA helped them with public procurement possibilities so that they could really become experts in terms of defence technology. The expertise that have acquired, it's via public procurement mainly that happened. Thank you very much. If we look at military spending or the defence sector spending in Canada, we can see there's a big share that's covered by purchases made in the US or outside of Canada. Now, with the first witnesses that we've had so far, and in particular, the Defence Department has said, well, it depends on the procurement process. Looking at that from the outside, when I look at the contracts that were awarded to Boeing with end-of-life aircraft rather than aircraft being produced by Bombardier, even if the Boeing aircraft to a large extent will be produced in Canada, but there's certain units with night vision goggles where this has been made to measure to fit in with what's happening in the US rather than to fit in with the Canadian context. So drawing on your experience, and not just in terms of your post as head of U15, what do we need to change to maximise the economic spin-offs of defence spending in Canada, in particular via Borealis and what's happening in universities? How can we maximise the economic spin-offs in our local economies? That's an excellent question, and that really is at the heart of the industrial defence policy, and that's what will determine whether it's going to succeed or not. Namely, are we going to be able, at the end of the day, to pursue public procurement that will help our domestic Canadian companies to grow and to take up more market share and possibly export then our technologies and our services and our equipment outside of Canada? So to increase our exports. And then there's a question of the culture of the Defence Department. I don't think I'll be the first, the last person to say that it's obvious that we've always turned to the US to buy their technologies because it was more practical, it was more integrated. But if we don't change this and if we don't encourage our domestic market, then first of all, we won't be able to grow our companies and help our companies to succeed. And secondly, the defence industrial policy will not actually succeed. So there needs to be this fundamental cultural shift, and there needs to be a shift in terms of public policy as well. That's really the heart of all this. Thank you very much. I've very much heard of that loud and clear. Do I still have time? You've got 20 seconds. Well, I'd just like to put a question about the importance of being anchored in the next budget.
Merci.
Thank you.
Oh, no, wait a minute. Sorry. Where are we? No. I'm on my second. No. It's you, Ted. Yeah, my bad. Oh, Wednesdays are long. Mr. Falk, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. And thank you to all our witnesses for your testimony. I want to, Mr. Borger, I'd like to begin with you. I want to pick up on a comment you made in your presentation, and you said that the Industrial Technology Benefit Program needs to be scrapped. There's things that are completely unrelated to manufacturing and defense procurement inside of that policy. Can you tell me specifically what you think the problem with that program is, or the impediments that it creates?
That's an incredibly challenging question.
That's what you're here for.
And to be honest, the ITB program is one that's relatively murky at best. And to really understand the ins and outs of the ITB program, it's important to, I think, bring someone from ISET in directly to speak to that. However, my experience with the ITB program, and we actually heard earlier with the parliamentary budget officers here, it's not strongly benefiting Canadians. We're seeing only 30% of 30% of those recipients are Canadian companies. We're seeing that process actually is often exploited by primes defense primes to a point where small SMBs are actually spending time preparing pitches in the hopes that they'll land a contract that might be outside of their purview, or the time that they spend on that contract is actually better spent doing the R&D or the development of the product that they're actually better focused at. In addition to that, in my role, I've actually seen pitches targeted to helping defense primes spend their ITB obligations with little concern over whether or not there's actually output that will benefit the Canadian economy. And that to me is concerning. It shows that there's a core, while the core concept of ITB is really fundamentally beneficial to the Canadians, it's just not being implemented properly. And this is why I suggested the repeal of the program.
Okay, so scrap it. It seems to be very difficult for SMEs to actually break into the defense procurement or the defense industry. What are some of the barriers that you've identified for small, medium-sized enterprises that prevent them from accessing defense contracts or tenders?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few things that stand in the way of allowing an SMB to commercialize their procurement with the Canadian Armed Forces or the Department of National Defence. Probably, and perhaps one of the biggest, is the lack of direct relation to an end operator. By the time a contract is issued, it's gone through several stages of review, and it's been distilled to a point where that contract is no longer valid to the end operator. The device that's produced is no longer valid because there's no direct feedback loop between the end user and the innovator themselves. And
can I interrupt you there?
Absolutely.
Are you a little bit concerned with this new initiative of a defense procurement agency creating another level of bureaucracy that's going to further compound that aggravation?
I think I'm hopeful, and perhaps naively so, but this is why I suggested that creation of that group is really focused on, very similar to what they have with Brave One in Ukraine, where every new innovation is actually vetted for its technological capabilities by an end user or a group of end users who can actually validate the functionality of that tech in a very rapid feedback loop that then immediately provides feedback to the innovator that is meaningful and allows them to develop their prototype to the next stage of commercialization.
Most SMEs, just for the benefit of the committee, most SMEs have to work through a prime,
yes,
as opposed to direct.
Yes, and
what can we do? And in some applications, I think it would be beneficial to Canada and to our defense industry or our defense agency to have a direct relationship with some of these SMEs. How can we do that or facilitate that?
Yes, and again, this is the back, I suppose, to my first point, is the review and reinvigoration of the Innovative Solutions Canada program, especially the testing stream. It's a gem. It allows innovators to produce their innovation, bring it forward to end users, and allow for immediate feedback, ideally with a third-party evaluator that can promote that dual-use component. So it's not just focused with the government as the end client, but allows for other users outside of the public sector. And I think that program really was an accelerator for many SMBs within the country.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Salt, I'd like to ask you a question as well. You indicated that the longer Canada waits to procure many of these necessary emerging technologies, the greater risk for Canada's continental defense and international security commitments. My question is, in what ways does government bureaucracy hinder Canada's ability to rapidly procure emerging technologies critical for national sovereignty and defense?
Just concisely, please, Dr. Salt. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just concisely. There's a sort of culture of risk averseness in the decision-making process cycles that we have within the bureaucracy here. That we don't want to make the wrong decision. We always want every decision to be 100% correct, rather than maybe 85% correct that will be delivered on time. And we need to just shake that sort of risk averseness culture and just be prepared to take a little bit of risk on as we make decisions a little faster to get the tech and equipment that we need on time and at cost.
Thank you very much.
No follow-up, eh?
Just because I screwed you over on your spot, Mr. Falk, doesn't mean I can add more time. Mr. Khan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for our witnesses to be with us tonight. I would like to ask a question to any expert. Mr. Berger, actually, I was thinking of you. So Canada's new government has made a historic and generational investment of over $30 billion this fiscal year, which will ensure we hit the NATO 2% spending targets. This summer at NATO Leaders Summit, the Prime Minister also announced that Canada will meet the new NATO targets of 3.5% and 5% on defense and defense-related capabilities. So as a member of Parliament who has an electronics engineering background, also who has experience with robotics and uncrewed land systems, I see these investments that are like very important steps for our sovereignty. And not only our sovereignty, but also for our industries. And that can take Canada to number one level of being, the name for defense manufacturer in the world. So in your perspective, can you speak to what these new investments mean for Canada's ability to produce new capabilities? Do we have what it takes to get the money out the door in time to hit our targets?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and especially the latter half of the question. The announcement of the investment is actually very welcomed by the industry. It's desperately needed, and it's very much welcomed. The challenge, though, is how do we leverage that money, or how do we get that money out the door? And this essentially becomes a procurement challenge. And it's easy to say we need to fix procurement, but that's a generational change. I think one of the easiest solutions we can do is delegate that purchasing authority to a lower level to allow for a more dynamic approach for procurement to actually happen. So we're not waiting for an executive level approval on a purchase. And we can actually have those procurement authorities delegated to a much lower level who are equally well trained, equally responsible with the public dollars, but are able to actually action that money a lot quicker. In addition to that, speaking on timelines, I think there needs to be a bit more of a consequential emphasis on maintaining service standards by procurement. There are times where I've worked with innovators, we've waited 6, 8, 10, 12 months for an answer to a bid or solicitation. Terms of service range between 5 and 25 days. And we need to get better at that. So that the terms of service are already there, and the announcement of the investment is there. So simply enforcing those terms of service would be very much helpful in getting that money out the door in a timely manner. That will mean a lot to the SMBs in the country.
Thank you very much. So your work at Acme Testing and Consulting, particularly in remotely piloted aircraft systems and robotic platforms, positions your firm as a strategic partner in this effort. And it helps bridge the gap between concept and deployment. So we have seen in Ukraine, and mentioned it several times tonight, that how low-cost at-your-table drones are reshaping modern combat. So the Department of National Defense has called this as a transformative opportunity for Canada's defense and security industry by enhancing domestic capabilities and protect our national sovereignty. So the challenge now is to build supply chain, as you mentioned, that not only supports Canadian SMEs, but also attracts offshore companies to establish operations here. So, Mr. Borger, from your perspective, what are the most pressing bottlenecks in Canada's defense supply chain that limit the ability of SMEs to scale and compete? Also, how can we work to attract offshore companies to invest in Canada, bring money into Canada, and establish operations here?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I can speak specifically to drones and remotely piloted systems. One of the big bottlenecks there is printed circuitry and the precious metals that go into it. Here in Ontario, we're looking at developments in perhaps the Ring of Fire or other critically important projects for national sovereignty. And I think it's fundamental that we actually work towards developing those programs to allow for Canadian SMBs to access the resources we need here in country. With respect to investment, I believe this is better suited to maybe some of my other colleagues on the witness panel. The economics is a little bit out of my strength.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
So over to you, Mr. Saint-Marie. Thank you for Mr. Border now question. Now you've said, and I'd like to hear more details from you on that, you've said that to guarantee dynamic procurement with correct surveillance, procurement powers have to be delegated to lower management levels. Could you explain why you believe that's actually needed? Thank you.
Thank you. And while French is a beautiful language, it's definitely not my first, so I'm going to answer in English. So the dynamic procurement strategy focused on with delegated authority, I think is fundamental, because now from my experience watching contracts go through, the budget analysis has been completed, the need for that technology has been completed by a management level, and then that request for contract gets pushed up to the executive level. That executive level is fielding 300-400 emails a day. And it might take several weeks for that email to just be addressed. From there, that then comes back down to the managerial level and gets pushed across for contracting. By allowing that authority to be delegated to a lower level, I think we will make that process a lot more dynamic. In addition to that, I was at the GC Expo recently held here in Ottawa, and I heard Lieutenant Commander Amanda Whalen speak about the option to actually combine delegated authority. So we have delegated purchase authority of a larger number than is currently there. And what that would do is actually allow like-minded individuals who recognize the desperate need for a piece of technology to combine, in a business case, the need for that technology and combine procurement powers and actually be able to buy tech, again, at a much more nimble speed than what we're seeing now.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair, as well. Perfect. Thank you for that.
Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Dr. Salt, you've observed in the past that the current procurement system tends to favor larger, more traditional defense companies over smaller companies that have very innovative solutions. How can the government restructure procurement to level the playing field for SMEs?
Things that come to mind right away is just firstly just accelerating the contract process time, because smaller businesses don't have enough capital runway often to wait months, half a year, years even. They need to pay rent, they need to pay their legal teams, they need to pay salaries. But the other, I think, key area that could be improved, I think, even quicker, is developing some sort of communication hub and / support hub. The Brits are playing around with this right now with their SME community and their defense sector, especially in the emerging tech space like AI, quantum. You have firms that have absolutely no personnel with previous military experience or defense experience. This is a whole new world that they are potentially seeking to dip their toes in the water on, especially with the increased money floating around. But they don't know how the processes work. They don't know how things like ITBs work. They don't know how any of this works. And I think it's very overwhelming to them to try to position themselves to get involved other than having a prime come to them. So having more open dialogue options with the department, just to walk them through the process and provide ongoing support as they potentially pursue contracts would go, I think, a great way, would go quite a long way in terms of allowing a more welcoming environment for smaller businesses to get involved.
So we know that there's a large number of projects that are pre-approved, and private sector oftentimes is ready to deliver, and government follow-through is often missing. That seems to be the case. So what would you say to innovators that they should do whose work's been stalled, not because of some sort of technical shortcoming, but perhaps because of cost overruns or bureaucratic delays in the procurement process? Like, what should they be doing?
Well, having had some conversations with folks, like especially in the small and medium enterprise area, is that when they're going through pauses domestically or in Canada, they first think about the export market, and especially the United States, which is quite frankly a bit more welcoming to them in terms of the U.S. DoD, when they want tech, even if it's in Canada, they will make it happen. So my usual advice, just informally to them, is just you have to look abroad while we figure out how to make things more effective here in Canada.
Mr. Borger, a question for you. You've indicated that contracts can take up to 6 weeks to move from ideation to submission to PSPC. You've attributed part of this delay to the fact that only executives can approve contracts exceeding $40,000, while management level employees across the public service are restricted to lower values. How does this concentration of authority at the executive level create unnecessary delays? And can you expand on what type of forms are needed to empower management level decision makers to make sure we can get this done in a timely process?
I'll deal with the second half of your question first. I think the empowerment's already there. The lower level of management is already trained on procurement. Some of them are taking 3 to 5 day courses on training. We're paying them well, as the government is paying them well. And we do that because we trust their judgment in what they're doing, and they're well trained to do it. So I think we already have the processes in place to expedite that. In addition to that, and with great respect to PSPC, if they are indeed as overwhelmed with contracts as they purport to be, PSPC essentially, and this is to my untrained eye, is simply contract management, managing appropriate trade laws and making sure that the contracts are put in place that meet all the checks and balances that the Government of Canada requires. Any law firm worth its salt could do that, and we could easily offload some of that work to a law firm that has that contracting capability, and then get back on timelines. And then when the workload is back, we bring those contracts back in-house.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Madame O'Rourke, up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I keep track. The United States and the UK have dedicated procurement streams for small and medium-sized businesses. The United States actually has a dedicated DEI stream. And given that there would be more competition at that level, potentially lower costs because it wouldn't be subbed out by Tier 1 than a Tier 2, would you support Canada adopting a dedicated small business or DEI stream?
Absolutely. I think it would help level the playing field a great deal.
Perfect. I'm sharing my time, so I'm going very fast. Thank you. Une question pour vous, Monsieur Asselin.
A question for you, Mr. Asselin. We talk about the military world and decisions that influence life or death. So at what stage, according to you, should we apply an ethics framework, in particular when it comes to using AI, autonomous weapons, or limits that we should not cross when it comes to procurement? It should be at the concept level, when it's at the university stage. Where do we actually place the ethics side of things within our conversation about the defence industrial strategy? Thank you very much for that question. It's a very relevant one. Yes, there's lots of different policies out there to guide university research, and I can only talk about that aspect myself. And this guides us on the ethics, what's permissible or not, and this concept of academic freedom, where researchers are free as to how they want to conduct their research and how they pursue these research questions. I think that's important. And then on AI specifically, that's a big field of research. How are we going to regulate AI? That's a big question. I believe that a policy will need to come from the Department of Innovation, ISED, rather than coming from the university sector. Thank you, and I'll give my floor to Mr. Bardisi. Thank you, Madam O'Rourke. And now for Mr. Asselin, very quickly. I know that your members have met with Minister McGuinty in Alberta this summer. What is the level of readiness when it comes to the executives within universities and defence procurement matters? Thank you for that question. Just to report back on this very productive discussion that we had with the Minister of Defence, that there is a sense of urgency on both sides. We understand that the country needs to rapidly mobilise all actors, including big research universities, so we're there to answer that call. Then secondly, on procurement itself, it's a bit more complicated in universities. It's not really there that we actually adopt the technology or purchase the technology. But when it comes to AI matters, big research universities can actually play a facilitator role when it comes to supercomputing and the capacity to generate big data. So there's lots of our universities and actors who play a very significant role on that front. Thank you. We received testimony from the University of Alberta. They've got their new Institute for Dual Use Matters. What have you heard from your members about that type of initiative? Thank you for that question. I think that out of our 15 big research universities, each of our institutes has established research capabilities and already has connections with the Defence Department. Of course, given the focus and the scale of this, there's a real call for mobilisation, so these efforts are going to be further stepped up. But I want to be quite clear vis-à-vis the committee members. There's already an immense research capacity within our research university vis-à-vis defence and national security, cyber security, quantum computing, AI on Arctic issues and the defence of the Arctic region. There's a great deal of capabilities, but we have to further develop these, and we hope we'll be able to work with the DND on all of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our witnesses. Appreciate you contributing. Colleagues, I did let the respective representatives of each party know we're going to go in camera for 5 minutes. We've got just one very brief thing we have to discuss. That means any members of the media, witnesses, non-authorized staff are going to have to vacate the room as quickly as you can, please, as you can't be here while we're in camera. Witnesses, thank you very much. Monsieur Asselin, merci pour votre temps. Thank you. Briefly,
Thank you, Mr. Asselin.
come right back in camera.